Hello everyone, welcome back on the list with this Duron. It is a 800 Duron and this is supposed to be the next project on our list. Well, it is a special CPU, so special that CPU-Z on their benchmark site has a section with the most miserable frequency reached with the Duron. Now, I really want to see if are they really that miserable or can they keep up with the rival, because they were launched to compete directly with the Celeron brand from the Intel. Well, now if we check its performance on the PC Mark 2002, I was really surprised to see that the scores were quite big, and it is a massive difference between the Celeron and the Duron in all types of performance. I double checked it. They were released in the same year at the same price. The Duron was released in October 2000 and the Celeron in March 2000, but the gap of the performance is absolutely huge. I've tested it with this K7 S41JX and I don't think it was fair because it used double data rate memory instead of SDRAM. But in the beginning, it was not supposed to be tested with this motherboard. Instead, I was planning to use a ASRock motherboard which had both DDRAM and SDRAM, and it was a K7 VT2 motherboard with a VR-KT266A chipset. And by the time I got to test the Duron, I assembled the PC and surprise, the motherboard wouldn't boot at all, wouldn't do anything. And so it has left the building and I was left to use the ASRock. But 2 weeks after, I found this other motherboard with SDRAM because I wanted to keep it fair and because I have something else planned for later and I definitely needed this SDRAM motherboard. And look at that, even with the SDRAM, it still doesn't suffer so much. It almost matches the DDRAM scores, and wow, I mean, really, this CPU is absolutely quite good performing. I wasn't expecting this kind of performance from it. Now, I've set it up with this new ECS motherboard, which I ran at 100 MHz frontside bus with a 133 MHz SDRAM speed. So here in CPU-Z, I'm about to show you that it is a Duron, a Spitfire model. These are the first generations of Durons to be released with 180 nanometers technology. It has 800 MHz clock speed. It has 64 kilobytes of level 2 cache, and this motherboard supports 4x AGP. I've paired it up with 512 megabytes of SDRAM, even though it supports more. So running a test with the benchmark now, just to show you that it did pull up those scores. So there's no trickery involved, it is just the same performance that was showed before. It is truly outperforming Intel in every possible way. And after seeing this, I went further to investigate where does that increased performance come from, because it's quite big. And here we have a comparison between the two CPUs, the Duron and the Celeron, which are both 180 nanometers. The Duron is clocked at 800 MHz, the Celeron at 600. They were both released in the year of 2000, a few months apart, and the major difference between them is that the Duron has a large level 1 cache. It's 128 kilobytes compared to the Celeron, which is 32 kilobytes. The level 2 cache on the Duron is 64 kilobytes, and on the Celeron is 128. But in total, because the Duron uses exclusive level 2 cache, it adds up to a total of 192 kilobytes of cache, while the Celeron uses a inclusive type of cache where the level 1 cache has to be duplicated in the level 2 cache, so it subtracts from its level 2 cache because it always has to keep a duplicated level 1 cache even on the level 2 cache. So that's why you get 128 kilobytes minus the 32 kilobytes from the level 1 cache, so you are left with 96 kilobytes of level 2 cache. The other difference comes from the frontside bus, because the Celeron has a 66 MHz frontside bus, the Duron has a 100 MHz frontside bus, and on the chipsets also the GTL Plus only performs one transfer per cycle, meaning that the chipset frontside bus adds up to a total of 528 megabytes per second for the 66 MHz frontside bus. And for the Duron, because the frontside bus is double pumped, you get a effective speed of 200 MHz, which translates to 1600 megabytes per second. So that is 3 times more bandwidth on the K7 chipset frontside bus design. Now, these are the differences in the CPUs, but there are also differences in the motherboard. I was lucky to get this ACS chipset because they are quite hard to find. I mean, something with SDRAM is quite hard to find, which still works even today. And after investigating a bit, I was surprised to find out that some of that performance increase comes from the SYS multi-threaded I/O link, which is a link between the north bridge and the south bridge, they both being integrated into the north bridge, and they use a type of bus which is similar to the hypertransport, but it only works between the north bridge and the south bridge. And from there they could squeeze up to 1 gigabyte per second, and that was very important because at that time the internet was starting to develop, and your communication with the modems, with the LAN, with the IDE, with the USB, they all had to go to this through the south bridge and through the PCI ports, which required more bandwidth. And of course that the difference was almost 10 times more than that of the Intel chipset, because on the Intel chipset the communication between the south bridge and the north bridge was still left at 133 megabytes per second. And here we have an article from ANandTech where even they admit that the SYS 735 chipset is the real deal because of that huge communication between the components on the motherboard. The motherboard that we have here, it's also a 735 chipset, which is exactly the same one pointed out at the ANandTech article. It has a AGP 4X slot. It can use double data rate RAM memory up to 266 megahertz, and it can also use SDRAM memory supporting up to 1 gigabyte of RAM memory. It also has UDMA 100, and here you can see that on the Intel chipset the front side bus link and the link between the south bridge and the north bridge is still left at 133 megabytes per second, which is why I may think that the PCI video cards didn't get quite the bandwidth needed. And that's also a thing which I want to explore later on and see if the differences between these buses and these designs of the chipsets also increase the PCI video cards performance, because I wouldn't have any other way to measure it, because the IDE hard drives won't fill up that bandwidth, and I wouldn't use SSD on it simply because I don't trust the SATA to IDE adapters that they can properly use the UDMA controller. And so I'll be using the standard IDE until we get to the SATA, where I will start to use the SSD ones. But for now, the only thing that could fill up the bandwidth of those PCI buses would be the PCI video cards. Now, here we also have a diagram, which is probably the only diagram that I found about the Pentium 3s, but this one is based on the i820 chipset, which is made for RAM bus memory, that's for RDRAM, and there we can see that they have some sort of link between the north bridge and the south bridge, which is 266 megabytes per second, which is a double the bandwidth than that previously used on our motherboards that we tested, on the Gigabyte one, on the G6VML, and also on the Intel D815 EEA motherboard, which are still left with 133 megabytes per second. But as I've said, the RAM bus was created for the Pentium 3 and not for the Pentium 4, so here we can have a grasp where some changes occurred for the transfer between the north bridge and the south bridge. Now moving on, we're still going to use the Nvidia Riva TNT2 Ultra AGP2X, because I definitely don't think it was maxed out with the Celeron, and I want to stick with something as a reference for different chipsets, which is a great idea, but also it is quite restrictive because this GPU doesn't support more than the DirectX 6, and newer titles or software will not run on it. Now, when I started benchmarking the video performance, we had a surprise: glitches. And checking it, I thought it was because the benchmark had some issues with the DirectX, but then I went on, started Dungeon Siege, the same thing happened, glitches. Well, I started a game, glitches, the glitches wouldn't stop at all. Again, glitches. Well, okay. Before the ECS motherboard arrived, I was testing it on the ASRock K741 GX1, and same thing happened there. But on that motherboard, I've used a different GPU. I've used the FX 5500. Keep in mind, this was before the ECS motherboard arrived. The motherboard with the SDRAM. And just as you can see, It was a fresh install, nothing tricky here. Fresh install of 3D Mark. The same Spitfire, Duron, so it was the same CPU on a different motherboard. Also, on this motherboard I could not use the Riva TNT2 Ultra because it has a different AGP slot, which would not allow me to use that Riva TNT2 card. This is why it is a different GPU, and I'm glad I found the ECS motherboard, because I wanted to keep things as close as possible and try not to make huge leaps through the chronology, just so we can have a side-by-side comparison and to grasp things better, because it's all about how long they lasted in time. It is the time proof of these products which is important. So in 3D Mark 99 glitches, I've went and installed the 3D Mark 2000 because they use different DirectX versions, and 3D Mark 2001. So one is based on DirectX 7, one is based 2000, I believe, is based on DirectX 8, and 2001 is based on DirectX 9. And glitches, no success with it. "3D Mark 2001", same story, more glitches. Now I went ahead and disabled the AGP fast write option because sometimes it causes problems. And sometimes you get it fixed by disabling the AGP fast write. Now I've also used only Windows XP to get rid of as many problems and incompatibilities that Windows 98 brings along. But in this case, same results, still glitching. But contrary to this, I'm really happy that it was this the problem. The chip die is quite heavily damaged, and that's what caused all the problems, because the damage has gone so far that some parts of the CPU was unable to use. And I brought the closest one that I had with the same level of performance, which is a Duron 1600 Applebred. And this CPU is not based on the 180 nanometers. It is a newer revision. And the difference in this is that it is a 130 nanometers one, and it also has an increased frontside bus to 133 megahertz. But what we'll do is we will underclock it So what we'll do with it is that we will underclock it to 100 frontside bus, which will give us a speed of 1200 megahertz or 1.2 gigahertz, and we will reduce the frontside bus in order to keep it as close as possible to the Duron 800, because it will not be fair to run it at full capacity. And I'm also using this only because I haven't found another Duron which doesn't have a damaged chip, because most of these CPUs are damaged. So try looking at that before you buy one. Try to see if there are cracks in it, or because the mounting system for it was not made to last. And honestly, I would not suggest to try and buy one that doesn't have real photos or has any kind of damage on the chip, because you might end up with the same glitches I have. But anyway, with this new CPU installed, I went ahead, switched to BIOS settings, and downclock it to 100 frontside bus with 133 megahertz RAM speed. We're still using SDRAM to make it fair. And I've also reduced the recharge time to 3 because I know that's the start speed. So the RAMs are rated for those time. Now the memory controller of this chipset is quite awesome. It was praised even by Nvidia. It has a very good memory controller. This chipset, I mean, most of the SIS chipsets are quite famous for their memory controller. And and running PCMark 2002 with this new CPU, we can see once again it has a huge performance increase over anything that we tested so far. So keep in mind it is running at 1.2 GHz and not at the full spec of 1.6. It still runs at 1200 MHz instead at the full spec of 1600 and is quite powerful even with that low amount of level 2 cache. Here you can see there is no trigger involved, it is same spec. And running 3D Mark now with this new CPU, and now we start to get to the good performance. Now here I'm starting to think that we overcome the CPU bottleneck and we are now getting to the GPU bottleneck, because as we can see in this course, the CPU is absolutely overwhelming the competition from Intel. In 3D Mark 2000, which is a very stressful thing for this GPU because it doesn't support this DirectX, but it does keep up, let's say, reasonably well. And most probably from here on, I think we are starting to get GPU bottlenecks, and we'll have to search for some different GPUs to actually make the full use of this chipset. You can see that on heavy details it struggles, and I don't think that anything else than the GPU might be the fault for it. I'm also not going to take this course as reference because I know quite sure this GPU is not meant for this. Now, another title which has come along through this series is Dungeon Siege, and I will now let you check for yourselves how the performance in Dungeon Siege is compared to the Celeron platforms, and also with the same GPU.
A long time ago, on the continent of Arana, the once magnificent empire of stars had crumbled into oblivion, paralyzed by its own power-hungry legions, and torn asunder by an ancient and merciless evil. But the 10th Legion, the dying empire's most valiant soldiers and most trusted, withdrew far to the west, to a land called Ebb, seeking to preserve what their empire had lost. Here, in the rugged mountains and the rich valleys of their new home, they founded the Kingdom of Ebb, the kingdom that has embraced peace and freedom for 300 years. But there was a price. Few now remember the evil that opposed them. Fewer still recall the dark sorceries cast to save them. And none could foretell that one humble farmer would stand between a vengeance from the past and the survival of the kingdom.
Attacking. I couldn't hold them back. You have long been my friend, but you can do nothing more for old Nordic. Go to Stonebridge. Find Bjorn. The Krug have elsewhere betrayed us. Your bravery will